Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 12 on world politics after the pandemic. This will be our last full lecture, and the final lecture next week will be much shorter. But this week we will be focusing on global politics after the pandemic, a subject that I'm sure you're all quite tired of now after hearing about the pandemic for the last 2 years. But that being said, it's so fundamental to the future of geopolitics that we can't not have a full week on it. So the agenda for this week, first off, the accountability assignment is canceled. So there will be no accountability assignment this week, as it says on the syllabus. So that is completely canceled. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we'll move those marks onto the self-reflection assignment. So now it'll be worth 15, but we'll get that in a second. But today we're going to be I'll give a brief introduction to the pandemic. We'll talk about geopolitics of the pandemic, where the dynamics of the geopolitics of the pandemic, and then we'll think about what comes next. What's the future of geopolitics in a post-pandemic world? And then we'll end with some questions, big questions to think about. But that's all we have planned for this week. So first off, I've decided to cancel the accountability assignment number 4. This is because you already have a lot on your plate for the end of the semester. And I decided that we'll make up the self-reflection assignment. We'll make up for these marks by making the self-reflection assignment worth 15% of your grade rather than just 10% of your grade to make up for those missing marks. And I feel like this will give you some time to study for the final test and work on the self-reflection assignment. So this gives you a full 2 weeks to really focus on the self-reflection assignment, study up for the test. And I think you've all earned a little break. So this week, I just want you to do the readings and watch the video. So a reminder again, the self-reflection will now be worth 15% rather than 10%. When I send out the assignment, I'll have that clearly stated as well. The self-reflection assignment will be due August 14th at noon, and it'll be worth 15% of your grade. So the final test will be August 15th, and will also be worth 15% of your grade. It will be at 6 p.m. Barrie time. So 30% of your grade is still yet to be determined. So if you're falling behind, it's important that you really work hard on these assignments because there have been some issues with some of you. That being said, the average in the course is very high. It's 72% for both of the tutorials or both of the classes. So it's a very normal average. Some of you have had some amazing assignments for the G20 assignment. Some of you have even gotten an A+. So that's really encouraging that so many of you followed the instructions carefully and did very, very well on the assignment. Some of you less so, but that's okay. You still have 30% of your grade to hopefully make up for these marks, and we can really work hard on these future assignments. Hopefully you've all got a lot of the course this year, and we're almost finished. So let's finish strong here, and hopefully we can get everyone past the finish line and get them the grade that you all think you deserve. So that's all I have to say there. All right. So again, I'm sure the last thing we all want to discuss is COVID, since it's been such a constant presence in our lives over the last 2 years. Almost equally disruptive is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which similarly disrupts global politics and global supply chains. I'm sure you've all been following some of the stuff that's happening in Ukraine and and the disruption it's caused for geopolitics and world order. Nevertheless, COVID is perhaps the largest disruption in the global political economy in recent memory. Even more disruptive than the 2008 global financial crisis caused by the U.S. housing market, which is wild because when I was probably around your age, when I in my early years of my undergrad, et cetera, we couldn't even imagine that anything could get worse than the 2008 global financial crisis, as far as the global ramifications go. But then COVID comes and completely almost diminishes its importance. COVID is perhaps more similar to aspects of the Cold War in terms of its costs. Astronomical amounts of money spent by governments, the changing of personal and state behavior. So citizens have changed their behavior, the states have changed their behavior, as well as the shifts in priorities of what the state spends money on. So future generations, when they look back on the world, 50 years from now, they'll note COVID as a major turning point in global politics and the economy, and one which occurred in such a small amount of time. If we look in comparison to the Cold War, the Cold War, many decades, this is just 2 years, and the transformative effect has been astounding, right? Recently, after the Cold War, global politics has often been shaped by significant shock events, 9/11 being one of them, the attacks on the World Trade Centers in 9/11. And these events have often had long effects on global politics. So if we look at the attacks on 9/11, it completely transformed the geopolitical environment through the things like the war on terror and global surveillance, and focusing on rogue states rather than large geopolitical foes, such as what characterized the Cold War, right, between the Soviet Union and the United States. So COVID is less of a singular event like the similar way that the terrorist attacks on 9/11 were, but rather a prolonged event which will shape almost every aspect of states in the post-COVID world. This includes public health, state spending, culture, international relationships, infrastructure, housing, trade, and many more, right? So it is a multifaceted phenomenon. Despite how we might not wish to relive these events, it's worth noting the various key points in the COVID crisis. So on New Year's Eve in 2019, China informs the WHO of what they thought was a pneumonia case or pneumonia cases without any cause in Wuhan. A week later, on January 7th, 2020, scientists discovered that this is not pneumonia, but rather a new strain of coronavirus, which has never been seen before. What was very interesting in comparison to previous pandemics is that we actually did have the technology to start combating the virus very early on. January 12th, the genetic sequence of the virus was shared around the world, so scientists could start working on vaccines and solutions for the virus. On January 21st, it was understood and it was realized that transmission was happening person to person in close contact. So these were, you can see here in the sequence of events, very quickly we understood what was happening in a way that probably wouldn't have been happening decades prior, right? In January 25th, 2020, was first reported case of COVID-19 in Canada. So within 26 days of the discovery of the virus, it was found across the world in Canada, all the way from Wuhan to Canada. This is a direct product of a globalized world where people travel frequently from one side of the globe to the other for things such as work, business, personal reasons, making it obvious that containing a virus is really an unrealistic strategy for any country in this context, because we're so integrated within this global economy and in this globalized world that containing the virus and shutting down and trying to contain this virus, it was almost completely impossible, right? Because by the time you start putting them into effect, these kind of measures, the virus has already been moving, right? It moves much faster than public policy. The virus doesn't really care about borders, about public health measures, but rather it just moves. It moved much quicker than governments were able to respond to this phenomenon. So on January 30th, the WHO declared a World Health Emergency. Cases exploded on ocean cruise lines specifically. These are these large ocean cruise lines, right, where people eat and share close quarters for a long period of time. And many of the people who actually frequent these types of cruise lines are very elderly. So you see very many deaths happening here on these cruise lines. So these boats, in effect, become kind of floating petri dishes, and many states didn't want to let these ships come to shore and even and expose the country to large masses of infected people. So on March 11th, COVID was declared a worldwide pandemic. On March 16th, Canada closed its borders, recognizing that they're not able to control the pandemic internally and want to prevent more people from bringing it in. On March 18th, Canada and the US border closed for almost 2 years. And then you start to see a breakdown of global supply chains. First thing impacted, I'm sure you all remember, were the Lysol wipes and antibacterial gels, which led, people stockpiling them and selling them at inflated prices, et cetera, because of this shortage, right? The next big crisis was the personal protective equipment, the PPE supply in hospitals. On April 4th, Trump told the company 3M that they could no longer ship N95 masks to Canada in order to protect their supply. So countries around the world were trying to buy and obtain PPE for their country, and not enough internal producers were producing these in many places, right? So in May 2020, unemployment in Canada went to 13%, forcing Canada to spend billions to protect workers who could no longer go to work for person-to-person contact jobs that could potentially infect them and others, right? So they 13% now were effectively unemployed and dependent on government. By the end of November, it is clear that the scientists that got the information in January were successful in creating vaccines to combat the virus. So on November 26th, Canada secures vaccines from 7 different manufacturers because at that moment, we didn't really know which vaccines would work. So Canada bought from many manufacturers and promised to share the excess supply it had with developing countries of the world who were not able to secure vaccines. Because we can see here, we can continue to see how there's an unevenness in vaccine distribution and how different citizens of the world are able to obtain vaccines, right? So by December, they began developing, being delivered around the world. Vaccines began to be delivered around the world. Starting with healthcare workers and the elderly, you see these citizens getting access to vaccines. But around this very same time, we see the rise of new variants, right? So by 2021, you see waves of new variants around the world, and countries still vastly unprepared to handle these new variants in places like Brazil, India, Europe, North America, Africa. And this is largely due to a lack of vaccine supplies, right? An unequal distribution. So you have this rise in new variants out of South Africa and India because vaccination policies were not global, but rather they were national projects, and vaccines were completely unevenly distributed around the world, which when you think about it, right, the virus doesn't really care about nation states. The concern of the virus transcends these kind of political differences and these political conflicts. So you can see here how, because we didn't have a uniform global strategy, there was all these issues that arose, right? So the lack of sharing of these resources made the entire world less safe. So in this reflexive move to protect your own nation's citizens for many of these different states around the world, actually made their citizens less safe because it led to a rise in new variants. And because it was not evenly distributed, everyone kind of lost. So there's many lessons to be learned, specifically why international cooperation is so important. The WHO faced a lot of criticism early on, but were limited to a system controlled by national governments, who they could not force to act in the interests of a global community, right? Nation states are self-interested entities. And in the context of a global pandemic, this self-interest impacted the global public health and harmed the interests of even states that thought they were acting in the best interests of their national citizens by hoarding supplies, by installing lax public health policies because many didn't believe the virus was as serious as that public health officials were stating. So we can see here how this lack of global strategy and this lack of internationalism really hurt citizens around the globe, right? Because we live in the context we've talked about all semester of a globalized world order where we have interconnected economies, interconnected markets, we have globalized travel, we have shipping and trade, and the idea that we don't have a political governance strategy that can handle that, we're still divided into parcellated nation states, parcelized nation states politically. So they were not able to handle this strategy on, even though we live in this globalized world order, there was no public health strategy that was fit to remedy this global pandemic. So maybe we'll stop here. I think we'll stop here for part one, and we'll continue in part two, and we'll talk a little bit more about the pandemic. So I'll see you shortly.